Capital Record, where we defend free enterprise and capital markets because we believe in the dignity of the human person. Hello and welcome to David Bahnsen's Capital Record, brought to you by National Review, where I can't resist the temptation today to devote our time to talking about tariffs. And you say, well, why would this be a temptation? Why do you need to resist it? What is the problem? And the problem is simply that this podcast is not where I go to do my hard-hitting investment commentary. The macroeconomic assessments that we do, that I basically do for a living, is what my dividend cafe is for. And of course, I do an awful lot of writing and speaking and so forth for the clients who we actually manage money for. But the tariff thing is more than just a market impacting event of the week that requires some kind of investment commentary. This more ideological podcast that is Capital Record does warrant some coverage of the subject of tariffs, because if my goal here with this podcast is to try to present sound economics from a vantage point of first principles, the way we approach a public policy matter like tariffs, just like everything else I've talked about, it really requires us to first ask, what are the first things that we believe that are relevant to the subject? And then there are going to be there's going to be subjects in which prudential adjudication of a given issue with two different people both sharing the same first principles come to a different conclusion, and people can have different opinions about the propriety of tariffs, or different opinions about what the marginal income tax rate should be, or different opinions about certain trade and regulatory policies. I do not use Capital Record to drill into the particulars of all elements of public policy, and very specific economic policies and issues. But what we do want to use it for is to constantly reaffirm the first part, which is what are the first things that matter to us in the way we approach given issues. And so when someone says certain things like tariffs are beautiful, tariffs are these big, lovely things that can do no wrong, and then it immediately becomes a political question, it becomes a tactical question, it becomes a campaign question. And there's all the things that have gone in just in the last like 6 hours, let alone 6 months and 6 years. The way this conversation about tariffs has gone, I can't think of another subject, honestly, that has required those paying attention to have a high tolerance for attention deficit disorder, because we start off saying we need tariffs to bring back manufacturing in the United States. Now, that's a first principles issue. What do we need to protect American workers? Is there some element in public policy where we're mistreating our own citizens? And we need to answer that question and then go on to say, and are tariffs a potential solution? But you can't really go to the solution part until you've kind of first done the other part. And that's what I always want to do. But see, this thing with tariffs is never really a very clear conversation, is it? Because we'll start off saying something somewhat provocative. I also think something extremely untrue like that, which is, we need tariffs to protect some element of domestic industry. And then we begin to discuss that, and someone will say, and you could talk about the cost of tariffs, and someone will say, what are you worried about? We're not really going to do it. It's just a negotiation. Or we need tariffs, the threat of the blunt instrument of tariffs, to get Mexico to put 10,000 troops at the border to help keep fentanyl out. And then if you question tariffs, they say, so you don't want to keep fentanyl out? And I'll say, first of all, I do want to keep fentanyl out. Second of all, I might not even have a problem pretending we're going to do tariffs to help keep fentanyl out if you think those things are going to work that way. But by the way, didn't we start off saying we needed tariffs because we were trying to protect American workers? And so I'm frustrated by the lack of coherence in the way this goes. I think there are a lot of really significant disagreements. And I think there are some areas that are not disagreeable, but even unpacking where people that are talking on the same issue agree and disagree is hard to do because the conversation switches midstream all the time. Right. I've had someone say to me recently, don't you prefer tariffs as a way of generating revenue to income tax? And I'll go, well, let's have that conversation. What are the things we're trying to accomplish? And do we prefer tariffs to income tax? And lately, because of the way President Trump has spoke about the issue, a lot of people are acting as if like that's what we did when the country started. We could go back to that. We used tariffs on imports in the early stages of the country, and we didn't have an income tax, and we funded government. So what's wrong with just raising revenue from tariffs? And you point out that it's no longer either or, it's a both and then they'll say, okay, but we're not ever even going to get any revenue from the tariffs because we're not even planning on really doing them because we're using them to get a better deal on currency fluctuation or a better deal on technology or a better deal on what they're going to purchase from us in terms of the trade deficit. So this whole entire subject is virtually impossible to have a coherent economic conversation that, let alone one rooted to first principles, because the conversation changes all the time. And so people say, what do you think about, like, over the weekend, what's necessitating this podcast here today? And God knows what's going to happen by the time you're listening to this in the news cycle. Um, Over the weekend, President Trump said, that's it. I'm done threatening. Tuesday, midnight, Monday going into Tuesday, 25% tariffs on all Mexican and Canadian imports and 10% on Chinese, except for Canadian energy imports, that'll only be 10. Now, when he went and pushed higher tariffs on Chinese imports in 2018, it was a much smaller number. And then there was like 1.2 million exemptions, carve outs, waivers, and so forth. So there are so many things I want to talk about with this issue that I could become guilty of the same ADD. If the tariffs are so good, why do we do exceptions? If the tariffs are there to generate revenue, then why do we believe that it's going to limit the trade deficit? If it's going to continue to result in the same level of imports, it's not going to lower the trade deficit. But if it does lower the trade deficit, then it didn't generate the revenue because we started getting less imports. And therefore, some people would be happy that the trade deficit narrowed, but you didn't get the revenue from it. Then I haven't even gone to one of my favorite sort of distractions that red herrings people throw out. Say we need tariffs with China because they commit human rights violations. And they'll say, well, should we not trade with countries that have human rights violations? Because that's different. That we should either trade or not trade with them, and let's have that moral discussion about who we're actually trading with and who's committing the human rights violations. Is a country that has human rights violations that take place inside their borders the same thing as buying chips from a given company or whatnot? And then that gets confusing with state-owned enterprises. But let's have that conversation. But then if it's immoral to trade with a given country based on a certain thing we're talking about, how do tariffs make it more moral? Like it's okay to do it if you get a tax on it? Or is it okay either way? And then we want to limit it because of the tax on it. So I hope you get the point I'm making. I understand that I can be very obnoxious in trying to be logical and coherent all the time. And I also can understand that it sounds like I'm doing a little backdoor compliment on myself, a humble brag or whatever the term is. That's not actually what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to explain that I truly care about this subject, the economic implications, the moral implications, the national policy implications, and I do not find very many people that want to have a good faith, honest conversation about it. If our goal is to limit what the United States buys from other countries as a means of promoting what we make in our own country, then let's have that conversation. And I assure you, I'm ready to have that one. And what it means to our exporters, because you say, well, we're going to help our own domestic manufacturers, but we are going to hurt somebody else. we now are less of a customer from one country, but then we are less of a seller to another country as well. And it invites third party implications. But let's have that conversation. Let's not pretend all we're doing is deciding between cheap Chinese goods and steel workers in Pittsburgh. It's just not true. Let's have a full conversation about where protecting one economic actor from another is or is not the appropriate role of state policy. But then that's a full conversation we can have. And if tariffs are a way we want to go about doing it. But then when we talk about tariffs and their impact on prices, if we say higher taxes give us less of the thing being taxed, let's say it consistently. I believe higher income taxes take away from income. I believe higher tariffs take away from trade. This is a tautology. I'm not saying anything controversial. Now, you can also say economics is about trade-offs, and it's a trade-off that you find worth it. I have no problem with having that conversation. Are we willing to tolerate some higher prices to affect a different objective? Or because we believe there's this thing called fairness, that another country has a certain rule, they subsidize their own domestic industry with textiles or soybeans or energy or steel or whatever. So we do tariffs to offset the impact of their subsidy. I have opinions against that argument, but let's have that argument about whether or not our intervention to counteract another intervention is what we're doing, as opposed to trying to discuss it in the context of protecting American manufacturers, separate from human rights, separate from currency impact. And then most importantly right now, we're talking about it as a revenue generator, and we're trying to have both our cake and eat it too. We want tariffs to generate revenue for the government, but we also want tariffs to limit imports, which means we're not generating the revenue. And then finally, the other underlying issue of just tariffs as a negotiating threat, which is, Kevin Hassett of National Review for years and years, a good friend of mine, a brilliant economist, now the head of the National Economic Council in the same seat formerly occupied by one of my best friends, Larry Kudlow. But Kevin said on CNBC on Monday morning that we weren't trying to start a trade war. We were trying to get control of the drugs, the fentanyl coming in our country. I thought what Kevin said was outstanding. However, obviously that's different than saying it's going to generate revenue, because what that means is it's a tariff threat done not to impact trade, but to not ever have to do it at all, as a means of getting the counterparty to the negotiating table, which, by the way, it could be substantive. We may get some real concessions, and it also may be kind of cosmetic. And that's very difficult for me to get into in this podcast, because I want to do economics and first principles here. And this other thing really becomes political. Do I personally think that Trump got a big victory for Mexico saying he put 10,000 troops on the fentanyl deal? No. I think he got a great headline and great optics, and I think he cares about that stuff a lot. I'm not convinced it's necessarily super substantive. The Colombia deal, and they're letting the plane land, and he used tariff threat to get them to allow the deported migrants to land. Look, I'm totally willing to concede that all these things are substantive victories. I don't think they all are, but they're not losses. Like, there's something. They're either cosmetic victories that are political and aesthetic to President Trump, or they're substantive. My point is that if they are negotiating tactics, they are not all these other things we were told they were: protection of American workers, a source of revenue, imbalancing the injustice of a trade deficit. If we've picked a lane, then we can go into all of those different lanes as to why a trade deficit is not theoretically unjust, to why a trade deficit is not even suboptimal. And in fact, why a lot of times a trade deficit is the sign of a very strong country. There also are ways in which trade deficit could be a negative. But there is so much complexity of this topic that good faith economists, and I try very hard to be one, want to talk about, and we don't get the chance to do it. And you're not going to get the chance to do it right now because tariffs are an entirely political issue, and the discussions are not being limited in that philosophical realm of driving human flourishing, driving the outcomes we want for a society. It is being used in a bait and switch with 4 or 5 levers. So let's have some tariff honesty at the right time. In the meantime, let President Trump have his fun. I have full confidence he might secure certain policy victories on the way. The blunt instrument of saying you will charge 25% tariffs, China, Mexico, Canada put together 43% of U.S. imports. That's about half of what we bring in the country. That is a massive cost to the economy. Anybody who tells you that that doesn't raise prices is lying, because there's almost no chance they believe it. Or if they really believe it, they're not credible in any way. But then if someone turns around and says it has no cost because it doesn't happen, well, I agree with that. Tariffs that don't happen don't cost money, but they don't raise revenue either. They don't bring jobs back to Ohio. They do solve the injustice of IP theft or human rights abuse in China. So let's let it play out. President Trump likes a little bit of chaos here. I'm not making a political criticism of it. It isn't my style. It isn't what I like to be the case. But I understand that this is what we elected, and I get all that. Should we actually go forward in a prolonged period of sustained tariffs with other countries, would it have an impact on the economy? Of course it would. Would it have an impact on prices? Of course it would. And would that impact be bigger than people realize because of knock-on effects and counterparties and third parties and so forth? Yes, it would. And this is where my Bastiat is going to come out in spades, because people will be ignoring invisible effects and long-term effects and how things affect all parties to only look at short-term, visible, certain party effects. That's not good economics. But we're not even doing that. We're not even doing that. We're doing ADD around a discussion of tariffs. And in the meantime, not doing tariffs and saying, see, tariffs didn't do anything. Well, tariffs that don't happen don't do the damage some of us who are against tariffs warn about. I hope that isn't complicated or controversial. Thank you for listening to David Bahnsen's Capital Record. This tariff story is not going away. I do not expect my podcast coverage of it will either. But somewhere in our ecosystem of good policy rooted to first principles, there's something to be said on all these different issues: the protectionism, the human rights, trade surpluses versus deficits, the good, bad, and ugly of all this stuff. And in the meantime, I'm asking people to try their best to have these conversations with good attention, focus, consistency, and in the end, that will lead to a better conclusion. Thanks again for listening to David Bahnsen's Capital Record.